All right. I guess we're going again. It turns out I need to keep these things under 15 minutes too. It's so far taken almost 45 minutes to upload the first video, and it's not uploaded yet. Good Lord. Okay, so now we're looking at chapter 6, and this will finish last week's lecture, and then we'll get into the stuff for this week. So, chapter 6, Roman Empire, page 108 in the text. And you get a little excerpt there, or a little overview. In the chapter outline, the subtopics are Age of Augustus, Early Empire, Roman culture and society, transformation of the world, and the rise of Christianity. Those are the topics we're going to look at. So we left chapter 5 with the end of the Republic, brought on by civil wars. The civil wars were brought on by inequality in the distribution of wealth and opportunity in the empire. And certain key players trying to wrest control of the state in order to, well, they say to help the people, but realistically to make themselves in control. So when wealth comes streaming in and you have greater luxury among some classes, you have greater poverty among others. And that creates political instability. When there's political instability, it's difficult for a Senate to maintain control. It's difficult for there to be a republic in control in times of great unrest, wherein people take violence into their own hands to pursue their ends. In other words, when people are no longer willing to or believe they can affect change to the political system through legal channels, then you have violence, chaos, anarchy. And when a society gets to that point, then you need an emperor to maintain military authority, and that was Augustus. Okay, so we pick up chapter 6 with Augustus in command of Rome, and he is what is called the Princeps. On page 109, that's his title, which is where we get the word prince. And it really means the first guy, more or less. And so he takes firm control in 27 BC officially, 31 BC historically. It was in 31 BC that he won decisively the last battle against Antony. And so since he had no rival, technically he was the only guy in real power. But it wasn't until 27 that he had those practical powers turned into legal powers. Now, as your book suggests, well, it doesn't suggest, but to make a long story short, really Augustine's period as emperor was to the great benefit of Rome. Yes, you could say, well, Rome lost its republican status, and Rome became, the Roman citizens were no longer citizens; they were now subjects, basically. You could think of it put it in our context. Just suppose, President Obama had to fight a civil war against the Republicans, right? Democrats versus Republicans, and suppose the Democrats happened to win, and then the president said, well, I'm going to stay on forever, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of voting rights. I'm going to get rid of Congress, and I'll just make all the calls. Well, a lot of people would say that, well, then, America's done. But what Augustus was able to do is, yes, politically, Rome was no longer a republic. So, but with his authority, he started to rebuild Rome. He reformed the army. He reformed the tax codes. He started building all kinds of things in Rome. He created stability. He put people back to work. And more than anything, he symbolized political unity. Symbolized, right? Because it was one guy maintaining power with his military. And specifically, one of the things he did was to create what is called the Praetorian Guard. And that was sort of like an elite force that was kept in Rome that was there to support the emperor and his cause. The point being, if you remember Marius and Sulla, and if you remember the triumvirates, one of the problems of a leader was if he didn't have an army right there to protect him, he could easily be driven out of Rome by other Roman generals. And so to avoid this happening to him, Augustus then created his own division in Rome called the Praetorian Guard that was loyal to him alone. Okay, the early empire. What your author is after in the early empire is emperors, to make a long story short. And I think I gave you something on Suetonius, did I not? That talked about Tiberius. No, was it Tiberius? Caligula. And here's what's to be said about that. So the first emperor after Augustus. So Augustus, gets old. And the drawback is he picked 2 successors. He himself didn't have any sons. But he adopted a couple of nephews. And so he had the succession squared away, but they both died. And to make a long story short, he ended up choosing a guy by the name of Tiberius, which was kind of like a distant nephew or something. Anyway, and so Tiberius, who was still loosely in the Julian family, he's called the Julians, that was from Julius Caesar. Because if you recall, Augustus's uncle was Julius Caesar, so Augustus is a Julius, the last name coming first to the Romans. And so Tiberius started out pretty good, then he lost his mind. Tiberius did. After about 5 or 10 years of decent rule, he retired to a pleasure island called Capri, where he set up a huge sort of weird sex orgy place where he hung out and had nothing more to do with Rome, and was brutal to his enemies. Caligula, who took after him, was just as bad, if not worse. There's all kinds of stories. By the time Caligula was in power, for instance, he made his horse a senator. He had people killed because he didn't like their hair. He had sex with anyone he wanted to include the wives of the senators. Tortured people to death for his own amusement. Just a sick guy. Until we got to Nero. And Nero was the worst of all. However, after these first emperors, so here you have Augustus, who stabilizes Rome, puts it back on its feet, and then you get these jokers that are just sick. And the system, by the time Nero died, by the time Nero had gotten to the point where he was losing his mind, and there was a coup that was about to oust him, he found out about it and he decided to commit suicide rather than be ousted from his position. And after Nero, who was put into power was a guy named Claudius. Okay. When Nero was murdered, Claudius was chosen because it was thought that the army could control him, because he was reputed to be mentally challenged, kind of thing. And so they put him on the throne, and by this time it was rather apparent that the army really was in control of things. So the point of that whole chapter is, especially if we put together some of the stories that we read about the debauchery of these emperors, things didn't go so well for Roman leadership. That being said, the empire itself continued to expand. The armies continued to push the borders. Rome acquired new territories in Europe and that sort of thing. And so even though leadership was terrible, Rome had created an administrative system that could still function even with bad leaders. Okay. And your book talks about this. All right. What else do we need to talk about? The 5 good emperors. Yeah, then you get some good guys in there. Trajan, Marcus Aurelius. Okay. So 180. Your empire doesn't really get too heavy into this. But of those 5 good emperors that are mentioned on page 112, the last of them was a guy named Marcus Aurelius, who died in 180. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, that starred, well, it didn't star, the character in there, the emperor, was Marcus Aurelius. And it was in 180, in the time of the 5 good emperors after Nero, when there was really decent government, stability, and prosperity in the empire for several generations. And so people often think of this era, the 5 good emperors, which is basically the the years, 96 to 180, as probably the golden age of Rome, when things were most secure and wealthy. After the death of Marcus Aurelius, when his son Commodus took over, things started to slide very quickly. Your book talks about the prosperity of the early empire, page 114, 115. To make a long story short, Rome was doing very well. And you didn't have very huge gaps between rich and poor. You still kind of did, but I'm not sure if your book gets into it. In this period, with the emperors, even the bad ones, the civil service expanded drastically. As Rome had to go out and govern these provinces, it would send governors. That's what they're called, governors. With those governors, they would bring aides. So you would need lots and lots of trained people to help, not only in the military, but administrative and overseeing building projects and all that kind of stuff. In other words, really a civil service. And the civil service was drawn from initially a small class of people called equestrians. But as the empire expanded and more of these people were needed for military, government service, etc., the equestrians, or sort of a middle class, expanded, and they had a pretty good share in the distribution of wealth. And so it wasn't too terrible of a gap between rich and poor. So life was good there for some while. And then if we keep flipping through the text, page 118, they talk about Latin literature, but again, we don't really have enough time to appreciate it. And so, sadly, let's just kind of flip through it. Gladiator shows begin, and you are probably familiar with gladiator stuff. The point of gladiators is, originally was called the games, and the games were traditionally, a part of Roman culture, even in the Republican period. In the Republican period, the games were mainly horse chariot racing. And there was some of these gladiator shows which were really theater. They weren't fight to the death. By the time of Empire, however, you had a lot of slaves coming in, and while wealth was better distributed, there still was an urban poor. And these people loved games, and so they got bigger and badder, till eventually the games turned into people killing each other for sport. You could probably think of an example from our culture of something like boxing, right? We had boxing, and now it's up to UFC, and the next step will be something that'll come from UFC, the ultimate fighting stuff, where they're all kicking each other and stuff on octagons or whatever. Next, they'll be fighting with weapons. At first, they'll be not real weapons, but eventually they probably will be weapons, and eventually they'll fight to their death. That's kind of how the evolution happened in Rome, until you get to gladiator combat. And what gladiator combat tells us is here we are at a time in Rome when the people are more interested in entertainment and debauchery than they are in government. So it's sort of a sign that the people are no longer really able to maintain government and social order. And then, you know what? I think actually we might be able to finish this one in under 15 minutes. When we talk about the origin of Christianity, which begins on page 123. Christ dies in 0, crucified in 33. Doesn't matter if you're Christian, those are historical dates. And the idea, or what begins to happen is Christianity begins to spread throughout most of the Middle East, right? But it does enter Rome through a guy by the name of St. Paul, whom your book talks about. And St. Paul was a Roman citizen, who became Christian. At first, Christianity was sort of not on anyone's radar because it was tiny and new. However, as Christianity spread, the problem with Christianity, and if you think of the message of Christ in the Beatitudes, Christianity appealed to women and slaves. And so it became sort of like the religion of the underclasses. And it was, you could almost say that a lot of upper class traditional Romans thought of it almost like people used to think of communism. It's like they feared this kind of ideology about sharing and all that kind of stuff. And so Christianity became a threat to the upper orders. And so it was persecuted. And you probably remember hearing of Daniel being thrown to the lions and all that kind of stuff. And that's what happened. I'm almost at 15 minutes, so I'm going to say so long, and we'll continue this in a part B. So look for chapter 6. No, forget it. chapter 7. We're going to go right to chapter 7. This is good for chapter 6. Peace.